Well, that sucked. That noise you just heard was a thrash metal style solo played over a jazz fusion track. Unless your goal is to torture someone, not great. But what if you flipped it? A jazz fusion solo over a thrash track. Could that actually work? Or better yet, could it even help define an entire genre of music? When you hear Metallica, you can probably name every past and present member without thinking. Megadeth? We don't have that kind of time. But the keywords that come to mind when hearing that group, maybe Dave Mustaine, Metallica, Rust in Peace, Symphony of Destruction, Marty Friedman soloing, Peace Sells. Megadeth has housed some of the most technically gifted guitar players on Earth. But there's one who only really gets recognized by hardwired fans or guitar nerds. And he happened to be Megadeth's official debut lead guitarist, who also might have been the strangest lead guitarist a thrash metal band had ever had. Chris Poland didn't come from the Sunset Strip shred world. He came from fusion rehearsal rooms. His roots were in the 70s, improvisation, all phrasing. Players who treated the guitar less like a weapon and more like a voice. Prior to Megadeth, he was playing in a fusion band called the New Yorkers. His lines bend in unusual directions, and he hits hard on legato phrasing. Wide interval jumps, notes that feel chosen rather than just blasted across the fretboard. I also hear a very vocal quality to his playing, almost like a horn. A lot of that style derived from a finger injury he had earlier in life. He essentially couldn't rely on tight alternate picking for extended passages, so he adapted and leaned more into hammer-ons and fluid legato, a lot of gliding instead of stabbing. Just looking at his overall hold, for example, you can see what I mean. A sort of loose three-finger pick hold and interesting motions with the fretting hand, with the pinky extending out for like 2 miles. Never really thought I'd ever spend this long talking about an underrated 80s guitarist's hands, but here we are. If that sounds like your kind of content, consider subscribing. After being dismissed from Metallica in '83, Dave Mustaine didn't retreat quietly. He did what most driven musicians do when they feel wronged. He wanted to start something louder, faster, meaner. He began assembling what would become Megadeth piece by piece. Bassist Dave Ellefson lived in Mustaine's apartment building. That meeting alone feels almost mythological in hindsight. Drummer Gar Samuelson entered the picture thanks to BC Rich. It was Mustaine's go-to guitar brand at the time, and Samuelson was managing the El Monte location. More importantly, Gar had a jazz background. That detail matters later. For a second guitarist, Mustaine actually first reached out to Kerry King of Slayer. The two had crossed paths during Mustaine's Metallica days. Slayer was between albums, and King agreed to fill in while the Megadeth project was still taking shape. But it was always temporary. King had his own band and his own trajectory. Megadeth needed a second permanent guitarist, someone who could handle precision, speed, and unruliness. They didn't have to look very far. Gar had an excellent candidate in mind from his previous group, the New Yorkers. That's right, Gar was bandmates with Poland. And just like that, the lineup was set. 2 thrash purists, 2 jazz fusion players. On paper, it made absolutely no sense. In practice, it gave Megadeth a massive edge. Chris Poland and Gar Samuelson didn't just keep up. They expanded what the band could sound like, and you could hear it all over their debut, Killing Is My Business. By the time Peace Sells arrived, the dynamic had subtly shifted. The band had tightened up. The mayhem was more controlled. But Chris Poland's lead work still stood out, sophisticated, melodic, and absolutely his own. To show you what I mean, let's do a quick comparison. First, an example of what you might call a typical era-correct thrash solo. It works. Fits the sound, maybe a bit shy on personality. Either way, Mustaine already checks the box for the thrashy, relentless solos here. So let's take those shapes and Chris Polandify them. Polandify. In other words, what's actually happening on the album. Yeah. By the time the tour for the album wrapped, tensions between Poland and Mustaine escalated. Personality clashes and creative differences were magnified by the lifestyle surrounding the band at the time. Drug use, late nights, compensation disputes, accusations of disappearing gear, and the general chaos of the LA metal scene. All things that Poland has been very candid about in recent interviews. After leaving Megadeth, Poland doubled down on fusion and improvisation, all while bussing tables at Denny's. In 1990, he released his solo album, Return to Metalopolis. Later formed the progressive group Damn the Machine, played bass for punk legends Circle Jerks, released Rare Tracks, a collection of demos and early experiments, Chasing the Sun, eventually launched the jazz fusion trio Ohm, and was even invited back by Mustaine to lay down some guitar work on the Rust in Peace demos, which you can hear on the 2004 remastered version. Poland even contributed solos to albums by modern metal acts like Lamb of God in the early 2000s. His style is so distinctive, and yet I've listened to Ashes of the Wake probably around 100 times and never would have realized he had a solo on that track. Actually, along with Alex Skolnick. Crazy stuff. Around that time, Poland got another call from Mustaine. Dave had a new vision for a record that he wanted to feel adjacent to Peace Sells, and he needed accomplished players to bring it to life. Why not just call the same Megadeth lineup he'd been working with, though? Well, a couple years earlier, Mustaine had suffered a freak injury. He fell asleep in a chair with his arm hanging over it, compressing the radial nerve and causing Saturday night palsy. He temporarily lost control of his hand, and at the time, thought he might never play guitar again. Megadeth was effectively put on ice while he went through intensive physical therapy. By the time Dave was back in fighting shape, he reached out to Poland to contribute leads. Chris agreed, but only as a session guitarist. He wasn't keen on learning the complicated solos of his successor, Marty Friedman, though I'd suspect Marty sweated a bit too when diving into Poland's early Megadeth lead work. Anyway, the result was The System Has Failed. The record was well received, a reminder that early Megadeth's voice was still alive, even in a new era dominated by nu metal and post-grunge trends. For Poland, he had mentioned that the sessions were pure fun. It was like he had never left. Let's give my favorite solo from that album a shot. Looking into his unique tone, Poland gravitated towards BC-rich guitars in the early Megadeth days. Not just for the looks, but because that's what the band was rolling with as a group. So models like the Warlock, Gunslinger, and the Bitch supporting Choose Death decals became part of that early thrash image. As time went on, Poland branched out in terms of guitars. He gravitated toward Yamaha models like the AES and SPG, and eventually got his own Schecter signature, the Poltergeist. This was a guitar that somehow seemed designed to both teach you about the merits of polyrhythmic inversions in a classroom and melt your face off with a metal solo in a trashy dive bar. On the amps and effects side, his early tone wasn't just raw distortion. He was already big on texture and sustain. In studio settings, he later talked about using tube preamps like the Bogner Fish and power amps, vintage Marshall cabs, and a rack full of compressors and harmonizers to shape his sound. At one point, he even described having a giant box of vintage pedals available during the System Has Failed sessions, which he used to experiment with sounds beyond typical metal tones. In the current day, Poland's primary focus remains with his group Ohm. He also put together Ohmfree, a jam band supergroup featuring members of Umphreys McGee, which is about as musically adventurous as it sounds. Outside of that, Poland has continued popping up all over the guitar world. He's made special guest appearances with projects like Kings of Thrash, actually alongside former Megadeth members Dave Ellefson and Jeff Young, released additional solo material like Return to Metalopolis Live and the studio album Resistance, and regularly posts interviews, lessons, and lick demos online. He's also still jumping in on guest sessions, including laying down a few excellent solos for my pal Mike Lopez and his band Lion Drome. Definitely check them out. So, next time you need a guitarist for your aspiring metal band, maybe try hitting up your local jazz school first.